Certain environments allowed for more possibilities than others, either offering the human many opportunities or either limiting him to an extreme degree. For instance, after the time humans first set foot on the Australian continent some 10,000s of years ago, all big mammals that existed there went extinct. The same happened in Native America. By the time of the arrival of humans, all big mammals, except for the llama and the closely related alpaca, were either hunted to extinction or perished through the climate shift. With everything discussed so far, a pattern has now emerged. South America had just one domesticated species, while North America, Australia and Sub-Saharan Africa had none. In contrast, the remaining 13 mammal species all existed on the Eurasian continent, including North Africa, because the natural environments there were more supportive of those species. Merely by determining the spread of these animals, the course of history already became predictable. Obviously, once a particular technique of food production had been found, that method was then able to spread to other people, societies. Crops and animals could be used outside of the area where the method was first discovered. Though, here again, the environments played a decisive role. If one look at the size and the orientation of the big landmasses of the Earth, one will notice that there are differences. For instance, the American and the African continents have a smaller surface than Eurasia. If we then look at the orientation of the landmasses, we see that America and Africa both have a vertical orientation on the map. The vertical distance between the two remotest points of the continent is called the north-south axis. Eurasia has a very broad horizontal orientation, which is termed the west-east axis. Why is this relevant? It has to do with the climate differences on the different latitudes of the Earth, such as the equator. These latitudes run horizontally across the globe. On maps, this is depicted as horizontal strokes. This implies that on a landmass with a large horizontal axis, the longest distance of that landmass will find itself laying entirely within one latitude or climate. Hence, plants and animals that are able to live on one area within one latitude will most likely be able to live in other areas within that same latitude. However, with Africa and America, because of the vertical orientations, the land masses are more divided by different latitudes. One merely need to consider the desert on the equator in Africa, nearly cutting off the upper and the lower halves of the continent from each other. Thus, different latitudes will cut up the continent, making transfer of animals and plants along a vertical axis more difficult. Let's illustrate this with a practical example. For instance, while the llama existed as a domesticated animal in South America, and while a type of wheel had been invented in Mexico, the two never met. As a consequence of this, the wheel never got any practical application other than being used for small toys. The two areas were cut off from each other through the climate barrier of Central America. Another point is that one cannot randomly move a plant from one location on the globe to another. For instance, plants have pre-programmed time cycles. If one moves a plant with a particular time cycle from one area on the globe to another area where the days are shorter, the plant will not be able to survive. Similarly, animals that have become resistant to the germs that live in one particular climate will become sick in a new climate with new germs. So animals and plants are bound to their climatic environments, limiting their free movement. So from that perspective, the Eurasian continent has had the most favorable conditions, allowing for the widest and fastest spread of domesticated animals and plant crops. On top of that, Eurasia has been the continent with the most available domesticable big mammals in fact. Thus, by its very conditions, the Eurasian continent was more supportive of the human. Let's now finally turn to the subject of germs. Why would germs be so important? When the Spanish conquerors invaded Native America, they had many points that helped them in having a certain advantage over the native people. They possessed firearms, were mounted on horses, were protected by metal armors and they had metal swords, though they were not in great number. The Spanish killed, conquered and converted many of the natives, but the majority was in fact killed by germs which the Europeans had brought from overseas. So, the cause of the near extinction of the Native Americans was not due to the conquerors, but the viruses. So who really conquered America? Though, where did these germs come from, and why didn't the Native American germs kill the Spanish instead? It seems the Europeans got their germs from their mammals. In the process of living together with their animals, farmers took over their germs, and over time they built a resistance towards these germs. Amongst the diseases that have been traced to cattle germs are the measles, smallpox and tuberculosis. A second origin of new diseases was the growth of populations in itself due to sedentary living. Because what happens with sedentary living? Groups of people start living in their own sewage, causing many bacteria to infiltrate the drinking water. Thus, the bigger the population, the more germs. Cities typically had to deal with epidemics. The building of underground sewage systems was the first point that allowed to really break the pattern. And only till the beginning of the 20th century did European cities become self-sustaining in terms of their populations, whereas before, a constant inflow of healthy farmers from the outside was required to compensate for deaths due to crowd diseases. Another point that has benefited the germs in Eurasia was the trading routes. Since they were built in Roman times, more easy transfer to the different parts of the continent became possible. So, now the populations of North Africa, Europe and Asia became one large breeding ground for microbes. Obviously, none of these points were intended or even understood. Thus, you could push the point even further and ask whether it is really the peoples of modern civilization that ended up dominating the globe at all. From a certain perspective, it is the germs that are dominating the globe. Perhaps that's why scientists call groups of microbes microbe cultures. Let's have a look at how germs operate. Some will enter the organism and will then start modifying the organism so as to develop what from a human perspective are symptoms or side effects of the actual disease. Though, from the germ's perspective, this modification of the body is what allows him to spread more effectively. Some examples: influenza, common cold and whooping cough, microbes induce the human to cough or to sneeze, thereby launching a cloud of microbes towards potentially new hosts. The cholera bacterium induces massive diarrhea, allowing the bacteria to spread through the water supply, of which many will drink. Then there is the rabies virus, that on top of getting in the saliva of an infected dog, will drive the dog into a frenzy of biting and thereby spreading the virus. Other bacteria will induce genital infections to spread through the human act of sex. From that perspective, it becomes difficult to ignore that more advanced species than the human exist in fact on Earth. It is even becoming more and more uncertain whether the human will be able to adapt to the evolution speed of new emerging diseases. They have been with the human since day one, and while the human's genetics haven't changed in the beginning, the germs have been mutating incessantly. So, within establishing why the Western world has ended up having such an advantage over the other continents and peoples, we have found that the human beings have had very little say in their particular destinies. There has, in other words, been no real directiveness from the human within his own history. Because, if one really look at it, as soon as certain conditions were in place, the human would start acting in a predictable pattern. At all times, the human has been directed by fear, greed, and a desire for power. Nothing revolutionary has ever happened, other than the human acting out his program, which has resulted in the world we see today. So, why have human beings never applied common sense to their reality? For instance, with the technology, the resources, the producing capacity and the knowledge that exists today, one could easily end things like starvation and poverty forever, allowing for every human on Earth to live a dignified life from birth to death. That would be common sense, because then there would be no more unnecessary suffering through things like war, exploitation, and other behaviors that are based on inequality. Remember, that ultimately the position, status and power one currently holds in this reality is a result of conditions that existed on Earth 10,000 years ago, and that it has very little to do with one's individual capacity. It was instead pre-programmed through the unequal conditions of the Earth. This implies that equality should be considered, because otherwise humanity will eternally remain a slave of the past. There is no intrinsic reason why humans should keep following the pre-programmed path of inequality that has been set out since the beginning. Therefore, all the suffering that is occurring as a result of it is completely unnecessary, and can actually be ended. It only requires the will to do so, and with the possibilities that are currently available, humanity has really no more excuse. It's time to stop.